Currents of wind slowly worked their way through the clearing, curling through and under the brambles that shielded the residents inside from the bulk of the wind's cold fingers. With them came the wrappings of the ever-present fog that manifested in the dark places of the woods. While it may have entered the clearing as a single massive cloud, the currents split the air and took the fog with it in a smoky airborne trail. One trail led high into the clouds above, another doubled back and led out of the clearing once again. One particularly bold stream of mist dared to venture further into the camp, nearing the strange lights that illuminated the nearby fog in a soothing amber glow. Suddenly the wind shifted, pushing the fog against the branch of an elm tree. As the wind continued to blow, more fog filtered past. Soon it had condensed into a small droplet of water, dangling beneath a single knot in the tree's bark. Slowly it grew in size, until eventually it broke away, plummeting towards the earth below. Its route was interrupted when it landed instead on the nose of a pale gray cat who happened to be sleeping beneath the elm. Arcel flinched, promptly raising his forepaw to wipe the spot where the dewdrop had landed and awakened him from his dozing. He opened his eyes to a quiet scene. The clearing was at the moment rather subdued in terms of activity. Most of the others were either out checking the torches or finding something to eat. The only other cat he could see was Shale, who seemed to be quite preoccupied with staring into space. The Tom's sleek brown coat was just a bit sleeker than usual and slightly glossy. Arcel suspected he had recently returned from a walk outside. Perhaps he had gone through the fire paths. Some areas were often foggy around this time of day, and would have left Shale's coat slightly damp had he walked through them.
Arcel!
A familiar voice called out from behind. Deciding he was up for now, Arcel lifted himself off the clearing floor and turned to see who it was. He was greeted with the sight of a lovely-looking she-cat filing into the clearing. The tabby's dark gray stripes covering her backside rippled back and forth over her silver pelt as she strolled to where Arcel stood.
Aaron!
Arcel's mouth drew into a grin as his friend came into view.
Sorry if I may have been sleeping while you were out working.
He quickly looked down and to the side in a slightly guilty manner, but managed to keep the smile on his face. Aaron gave a friendly cuff on the shoulder.
Don't worry, I'm not too mad at you. Although I wouldn't mind taking an hour or two to nap tomorrow morning while you go out to check the torches.
Well, maybe I can make it up to you. Would you like me to help you out with any torches you haven't checked yet?
I only have a few more I need to take a look at for the day. Why not tag along?
Arcel took a second to flatten out a tuft of fur on his head that stuck up after he'd slept on it funny.
Fine by me.
He made his way over to the fire pit located at the center of the clearing. Alongside it were several shallow containers fashioned out of old tree bark. The pieces formed a small bowl, with the inside turned a sooty black from the countless days and weeks carrying hot embers from the fire. Carefully, Arcel threaded his forepaw around the twine that formed a handle for the ember bowl. Then, as he had done many times before, he used the bowl to scoop a small pile of glowing coals from the edges of the fire pit. Deciding he had gotten enough, he placed the twine handle in his mouth and walked over to join Erin, who was already on her way out of the clearing and into the fog-shrouded woods beyond. It was at least an hour that the two had been on the fire path. Guided by the light of the large standing torches placed along the trail, Aaron and Arcel treaded on through the silent Sylvian environment. Arcel had never quite gotten used to the look of the forest. With few bushes and brambles to speak of, the woods were instead populated by a seemingly endless amounts of trees, mainly clusters of aspens. There was also the occasional elm, and Arcel could name at least 2 spots where an oak tree grew. What Arcel could never get used to was not the trees, but the fog. It was everywhere. Anything farther than 50 feet off the torchlit path was nothing but a gray and shadowy silhouette. He had to admit that when he was younger, there were more than a few times he had mused the idea of bravely venturing off the trails in search of a glorious something or other. Now, though, Arcel knew it was well within his best interests to stay near the light of the fires, whether it be from a torch on the paths or the fire pit in the clearing. He had seen firsthand what happened to a cat who lost the protection of the flame. They were at the distortion's mercy. The mist contained forces that were far beyond what anyone could combat.
You think Flint's found that eagle nest he keeps talking about?
Aaron's question snapped Arcel out of his train of thought. Arcel mumbled through the twine he held between his teeth. He still had the ember bowl in his mouth. The Tom looked down at the coals it contained. They were still glowing bright, though noticeably dimmer than when they had left the clearing. The twine did, however, make it extremely difficult for Arcel to hold up any conversation without stopping to set down the ember bowl.
You know that kid's been saying he can hear eagles calling up in the sky.
Aaron continued the rather one-sided conversation.
I ought to take him outside the clearing to see if he has any idea where the nest might be. I might even be able to take him on a firewalk.
Arcel answered with a solid shake of the head.
You think he's still a bit young to be going on a firewalk?
Aaron was referring to a tactic the cats used when they needed to walk off the fire path. It involved taking a small personal torch and carrying it in one's mouth. Though small, the fire it provided was just enough to keep the fog at bay, and with it, the distortion. It was by no means a risk-free endeavor. Unlike the large torches on the fire path, the small personal torches only lasted so long before they would start to burn one's face once the flame burned far enough down the wood. Worse still, if the flame were to go out for any reason, there was little hope of a cat finding their way back to the trails before the distortion set in. Arcel felt that Flint was still far too young to be taking those sort of risks, even if Aaron were with him. Aaron sighed as she let her head droop towards the forest floor.
I guess you're right. Maybe in another few weeks.
She lifted her head back up again.
Maybe you and I could.
She paused when she saw Arcel freeze in place. Aaron was about to ask what was wrong until she followed his gaze to see what troubled him. The next moment, Aaron was frozen as well. The torch ahead of them had been extinguished. Arcel was greeted with the open arms of nothing but thick gray fog, offset only by the faintest glow of the next torch far in the distance. It had been a long time since a torch went out completely. The cats checked the torches thoroughly, and often, to ensure they were always well fueled and never burned out. But even when everything was done perfectly, they couldn't control everything. Arcel looked at Aaron with a concerned expression in his eyes. Neither of them had a branch they could use as a torch, and the forest floor around them held only small twigs, too small and too dampened by the fog to be flammable. Arcel's only choice was to make a mad dash for the place he knew the unlit torch was positioned, and relight it with the embers he carried in the bowl. Aaron knew this just as well, and gazed with fear for her friend at the daunting fog.
Be careful and be fast. If I see the fiery light, I'll follow you down. If not...
She cut off, refusing to consider the alternative. Unable to respond with the ember bowl in his mouth, Arcel simply met her blue eyes with his. The message written in them was clear.
Don't worry. I'll be alright.
Before Aaron could object, her friend bounded into the dense fog, disappearing in a heartbeat within the gray cloud. Left alone under the light of the last lit torch they had passed, Aaron simply waited. Waited and hoped. The effect of the fog was almost instant. Arcel was only out of the light for a few seconds before he could feel the first signs of the distortion. The cold that gripped his pelt after leaving the torch's heat now dug deeper than it should have, and he was quickly filled with a powerful sense of unease. He had to move quickly. With a final bound, he reached the point where he remembered the torch being when he had last saw it ablaze. It should have been an easy task. Get to the torch and light it. Except, it was no longer there. Arcel was certain this was the place, but the torch was gone. In its place was a young elm tree.
This isn't right. It should be right here.
Arcel's unease quickly turned to panic. He had to find the torch, and he had to find it now. He immediately began to sweep the near vicinity. It couldn't have been far from here. In a frenzy, he darted back and forth across the path. Arcel was moving too quickly to react when the shape of the torch melted out from behind the cover of fog. He plowed headfirst into the sturdy wooden structure, but he didn't let it disorientate him for more than a moment. He drew his head back, aiming to throw the ember bowl directly onto the pyre. He knew he needed to relight it as soon as possible, yet he hesitated.
Is someone out there? Anyone, please!
There was a loud yowl. Arcel was certain he heard someone, or something, in the distant fog. The forest muffled the words beyond recognition, but there was definitely something calling from far beyond the path. Arcel turned his head in an attempt to get a better reading on the strange voice. The more he listened, the more it sounded like the screaming of a cat in distress. Were they calling out for help? Suddenly the distortion hit Arcel like he was being thrown against the solid trunk of an oak. He had waited too long to relight the torch.
No!
Violent spasms ravaged across Arcel's body, and despite his best efforts to hold onto it, the ember bowl slipped from his jaws and clattered to the ground. Arcel knew it wouldn't be long before the hallucinations started.
I'm as good as dead now!
He knew very well that once his mind entered the final stages of distortion, there was little anyone could do to save him. Arcel decided to close his eyes and wait.
Let's just get this over with then!
There he is!
Arcel snapped his head up at the cry from further up the path. Double-visioned and blurry, he saw a dark shape bolt in front of him to grab what must have been the ember bowl. In a flash, the bowl was heaved onto the unlit torch. Sparks flew, and within seconds the entire area was bathed in a warm light. As the torch banished the forest fog to the very edges of its light, so too did the fog of distortion lift from Arcel's mind. Finally able to focus his eyes, he looked to see the identity of his savior. In the space between himself and the torch stood a black Tom. His coat was unkempt, forming a mass of bristly, spine-like tufts along his back. The Tom faced away from him, but Arcel was nonetheless able to recognize the silhouette of a cat he knew all too well.
Tracker?
Arcel got back on his feet, clearly grateful this Tom had saved his life mere moments before he would have been gone for good.
Idiot!
The black Tom whipped around, bringing his face just inches away from Arcel's. His eyes were ablaze, and the white crescent marking that adorned the right side of his face twitched with loathing.
What were you doing?
Tracker, let him be!
Aaron leapt into Arcel's field of view from the same direction Tracker had appeared. With a definitive flick of the tail, she motioned for Tracker to back down. To Arcel's relief, the black Tom complied. With a sigh, he took a few steps in the opposite direction and calmly sat down, although he could still see the glare of annoyance lingering in Tracker's eyes.
But Tracker has a point, Arcel. What were you doing just standing there?
An expression of concern and curiosity swept across Aaron's face as she spoke.
I'm not sure.
He trailed off, neglecting to provide any sort of reasoning. Tracker wasn't satisfied with this answer.
You should have been lighting the torch if you had any sense of self-preservation.
The harshness of Tracker's voice was only supplemented by the truth in his words. Why had Arcel hesitated? Because of some random sound he may or may not have heard off in the forest? That was no reason to delay in saving his own skin.
I'm not a moron, Tracker. I just got distracted. That's all.
You don't get distracted when your life is at stake.
Aaron stepped between the two Toms before they could go any further.
Why don't we just drop this here and head back to the clearing? Arcel is safe. That's all that matters.
She promptly treaded off in the direction of the clearing, leaving before the others could open their mouths to disagree.
She's right. We should go back.
He turned to look at Tracker, who was still sitting adjacent to the torch.
And thanks for saving me.
Tracker didn't reply. He simply rose to his feet and fell in line behind Aaron with nothing but a final, solid glare of disapproval towards Arcel. The Grey Tom sighed. He didn't really know why he would have expected any different of Tracker. He decided not to continue checking the torches, electing instead to follow the others back to the clearing. Trailing the outlines of his friends in the torchlight, Arcel turned his head to glance at the path behind him. He was certain he had heard the voice in the fog again. It was fainter this time, like it came from further away, but it was nevertheless there. Arcel's eyes scoured the dense fog for a long while, before he finally turned to catch up with the others.